Welcome back. Okay, today it's fun. It is our Shadowlands lore primer. This video is going to take you through recent events and motivations for the core cast of characters who will be joining us on this expansion. And that means that even if you did not play or pay attention to BFA, well, with this video, you're going to feel right at home in Shadowlands. And speaking of home, well, we've got things for yours because this month's Patreon is pretty big. We have got, bam, 2 pins. We've got the Demon Hunter class pin as part of our class series and the 2020 edition of our channel pin, as well as art and the sticker. And it's been really cool, by the way, seeing pictures of like your art walls in your houses. That's been awesome. So that's November Patreon. Of course, also there we've got our daily game news service. We have got behind the scenes content and early access to things as well. It massively helps us in what we're doing, both for Shadowlands, which will be chunky, and for our big plans after Shadowlands, which will be even more chunky. So thank you for that. Enjoy the loot. And with that said, let's go. The Battle of the Broken Shore had consequences that we are still dealing with. Varian Rin died, which of course was a wound to the Alliance, but more important to our story was the death of Vol Jin. You see, as he died, a voice from the Shadowlands told him to announce Sylvanas as the war chief of the Horde. Well, we of course now know that Sylvanas was working with the jailer, and her next step was to funnel as many souls into the Maw, his realm of the Shadowlands. And the best way to do that, of course, was a good old-fashioned war. The lead up to this war began as a planned gathering in Arathi between separated Forsaken and human families. Of course, when Sylvanas saw the Forsaken attempting to defect to the Alliance, she ordered her Dark Rangers to kill them all. Defections would have been disastrous for Sylvanas' plan. Yes, she needed soldiers, but more importantly, it made future diplomacy between the Alliance and the Horde impossible. It was at this stage that Gan and Anduin decided that there was no redeeming Sylvanas, that she had to go. And this was the beginning of a cold war between the Alliance and the Horde that would play out in Silithus as Azerite, a powerful new substance, emerged from the wound caused by Sargeras' sword. It was not all straightforward, though. You see, Sylvanas needed to convince the Horde to actually act, to go to war. So she got Varrock Saurfang and the Orcs on her side by asking Saurfang a number of questions. And in doing this, she got Saurfang to admit that, well, Stormwind was too strong for them to breach, but that the Siege of Orgrimmar proved that Orgrimmar could be breached, that the Horde could be defeated. So, as such, with war looming, because of course of Azerite's emergence, well, the Orcs were convinced that a first strike was their only option. As for the rest of the Horde, well, the prospect of an Alliance-made Azerite superweapon soon shut them up. With both factions' fleets gutted after assaulting the Broken Shore, it was decided that the full weight of the Horde would instead fall upon the Night Elves. Victory would secure Kalimdor, and thus the War of Thorns began. Tyrande, you see, had been amassing an army, but in Silithus, thinking that the war would begin there, and of course, over the new resource of Azerite. But no. Back in Orgrimmar, Saurfang and Sylvanas' counterintelligence operations had the Alliance confused, thinking they would strike at Silithus, and instead, of course, allowing Saurfang's host to sweep through Ashenvale and eventually siege Teldrassil. And during that war, Delaran, who had led many of the Night Elves in the campaign, was killed. She came to believe that Elune, their people's god, had abandoned them. It was then, of course, that Sylvanas burnt Teldrassil to the ground using her siege engines. And by this stage, and unbeknownst to us at the time, the machinery of death within the Shadowlands had been broken. Normally when a soul dies, it would go to the Shadowlands, it would come before the Arbiter, and the Arbiter would tell basically where that soul would go. The Arbiter would direct it to the realm it was meant for. But with the machinery of death being broken, the Arbiter being dormant, well, those souls would just fall, and they would fall into the Maw, the Jailer's realm. So, those who died in the fighting and in the burning of Teldrassil all fell into the Maw, and then their anima gave the Jailer even more power. Tyrande, of course, seeing this happen to her people, rightly placed the blame of Teldrassil and the Fourth War at Sylvanas' feet. And in Shadowlands, she will do anything to kill Sylvanas. Months later, of course, the fight to reclaim Darkshore forced Tyrande to attempt the ancient and dangerous Night Warrior ritual. Sacrificing an orc's head to the dark aspect of Elune, her eyes turned black and she became the living embodiment of Elune's wrath. Tyrande and Malfurion drove the Horde out of Darkshore, but it was too late. Those lives had already been lost, and as for people who were a bit closer to Tyrande, well, Dalaran Summermoon, who she had seen, of course, defending Ashen Vale, well, she was raised up as a Dark Ranger. The same goes for Syra Moonwarden, one, of course, of the Watchers. By this stage, it's very clear that Tyrande no longer really trusted or respected Anduin, or at the very least thought he was soft and compromised. And we know this because her strike in Darkshore was unauthorized. It was against his orders, and it took key resources away from the Alliance's war effort. So, with the lessons of calm and patience learnt from Varian Wrynn in Pandaria firmly forgotten, and her now being extremely powerful, Tyrande is one of the most dangerous characters in the game. Blizzard are setting her up to be a super powerful avatar of Elune, one who will face off against a super powerful avatar of death in the form of Sylvanas. The crown was suddenly thrust upon Anduin's head following his father's death. It, of course, was a huge responsibility, one made worse by this catastrophic war that was on the horizon. And when Teldrassil happened, he was horrified, seeing it as a personal failing. Because, of course, at that meeting in Arathi, he was there. He saw Sylvanas kill those defectors, and he ended up doing nothing. Maybe if he had have done something, the whole burning of Teldrassil would not have happened. But it did, and in retribution for Teldrassil, the Alliance basically took the Undercity. They defeated the Horde, but they had victory snatched from them by Sylvanas' blighting of the city, killing many soldiers and denying them the strategic victory. In this, Saurfang was captured, and sometime later, Anduin visited his cell, managing to convince the old orc that they had more in common with each other than Sylvanas' new horde. Together, the pair sparked a successful horde revolution, one that of course ended with Sylvanas making it very, very clear where her ambitions truly lay. In her eyes, the rebellion's victory was inconvenient. It didn't matter because death would claim them all. It's clear that this whole situation came at a massive personal cost to Anduin Wrynn. Not only the death of his father previously, of course, but to put it lightly, through BFA, he had a stressful year. His nature wanting peace, his friends like Gen, his mentor even pushing him for war, and in the form of Tyrande, having one of his subordinate leaders going rogue. By the time the Shadows Rising novel took place, it is very clear that this was all weighing on him. Anduin's journey as a faction leader is a huge part of his arc, but there is another incredibly important part of his dimension. He holds the weight of the Alliance on his shoulders, yes, but also, well, that of two cosmic forces. And this is what I'm getting at. It was made extremely clear in Shadows Rising that Anduin is unstable, angry, and that the Void might actually take him, because in a moment of weakness, a Void Wisp surges down his arm when he is trying to interrogate an enemy. It was only for a brief moment, yes, but it did happen. And it's a plot point that Blizzard mandated happen in that book. You do have to wonder what the emotional scars of the Fourth War, and of course of the Shadowlands, will lead to. Well, Anduin, just like us, has got a lot to learn about the cosmos in the Shadowlands, and that's not even mentioning the potential for him to, say, meet his own father, the soul of which we currently know nothing about. Jaina was another major character in the Fourth War, coming to terms with some of her past and leading the Alliance war effort in Dazara lore. Well, when it comes to the Shadowlands, she of course was abducted by Sylvanas and taken to the Maw, where we eventually do find her. But I think there may be another angle to her involvement, her inclusion in this expansion. You see, in Warbringers, yes, 2-3 years ago, we see Jaina traveling on a river with a ferryman. The water is filled with dead sailors, and it could maybe represent the Kulturan realm of the Shadowlands. After all, we did see the Drust's realm bleed into Azeroth during BFA. But of course, her father, Dalen Proudmoore, who was murdered, killed by Jaina's allies during the Third War, was revealed to be that ferryman. Now, this all represented Jaina beginning to be ready to return to her homeland to come to terms with everything, but with us actually going to the afterlife, we do have to wonder, will she actually meet her father? And of course, if we're going to the afterlife, who was involved in the death of her father? Well, Thrall. Thrall, who also is in the Shadowlands with us. Of course, Bane Bloodhoof's father, Karn, was involved in the death of Dalen, and while we don't know if we'll see Karn, we do know that Bane will be there. Bane Bloodhoof was the first Horde leader to reach out to the Alliance during the Fourth War, and he was one of the few voices who was opposed to Sylvanas' war. When the Horde went to Zandalar, Bane went along with them to make sure the Horde never lost sight of who they were. Bane, like the old war chief Vol'jin, is a good soul, and Bane ended up requesting a seance with the spirit of Vol'jin in order to find out who actually told him to make Sylvanas the war chief. Vol'jin did not know. Later, he and Bane traveled to Bomsamdi's necropolis to find out what happened, but Bomsamdi, the troll low of death, ended up having no involvement in it, and was concerned, for Sylvanas was not his friend. So, he set off with Bane and Vol'jin to find out what went on. They all travelled to Icecrown seeking the Lich King's counsel, yet no, the Lich King had no involvement in Vol'jin's soul. Later, they met Aegir, who told them that Vol'jin had been touched by the hand of Valor. But we didn't know anything else. Shadowlands seeks to and does explain much here. I won't spoil it to you, but some things to think about are: who spoke Sylvanas' name to Vol'jin? He was touched by the hand of Valor. What does that mean? Whose hand? Well, now that you're prepared with that lore, I think there's a few plot points that you're going to really hit once you actually get into the Shadowlands. Thrall, of course, is another character returning for this expansion. He killed Garrosh Hellscream in a way that actually left him conflicted. In Words of Wind and Earth, we are told that from Thrall's perspective, a weapon meant for justice and virtue had been used for vengeance. That, of course, is Thrall talking about the use of the Doomhammer to kill Garrosh. Now, Thrall actually believed that this is why the elements had abandoned him, but in reality, it was his own guilt over his handling of Garrosh, of the entire situation, that led to Thrall no longer believing in himself, and no longer being able to manifest the power of the elements. He stepped back from the Horde, and he moved to Nagrand to settle in with his family for a peaceful life. But that, of course, was not to last. Saurfang visited him, fended off a group of assassins, and convinced Thrall to join the rebels. And while the throne could have been his prize for the rebels' victory, Thrall denied it, suggesting instead that they form a council. Later on, in Shadows Rising, Thrall tries to speak with Tyrande. He attempts to explain the Horde's new side, their council, why they're better now, and what actually happened. But she just did not care. All she wanted was vengeance, and of course, she harbored a lot of hatred towards the Horde. Yes, even though Sylvanas abandoned them, the Orcs still did do what they did. Saurfang still did lead them. Thrall bared through her frosty attitude, saying that he would bring her the head of Sylvanas. Tyrande told him to do it, or to never speak to her again. Though she did break a smile whenever he said that. Either way, Thrall did stay true to her request, later handing in Syra Moonwarden, a warden, of course, turned Dark Ranger, over to the Alliance. But, of course, he did so while not talking to Tyrande. Overall then, Thrall may once again be a peacemaker between the Alliance and the Horde, but for now, he is headed to the Shadowlands along with ourselves, Anduin, Jaina, Bane, and Bolvar. Well, you might be wondering how, and well, it turns out the Jailer's power reaches well into the mortal realm. Anduin, Jaina, Thrall, and Bane are all captured by the Jailer's Mossworn, and they're all brought to the Shadowlands to the Maw, and it happens during pre-patch quite soon after the main Shadowlands cinematic. Anduin was likely taken because he did thwart many of Sylvanas' plans, and also, of course, his moral leadership. He, of course, ended up leaving command of the Alliance forces to the much more compromisable Thrallian. And if that seems surprising to you, given that he seems to be a very bright, virtuous character, and you'd like to understand why I say this, then I would say that the Jailer and Death has great understanding of the other cosmic forces, and with that in mind, you should really watch this video. As for Jaina, she's a powerhouse of the Alliance, and she is intelligent enough to work her way out of just about all situations, so locking her in the Maw would make sense. As for Thrall, well, much like how Anduin is the moral core of the Alliance now, Thrall is the moral core of the new Horde. He was a rallying cry to the rebellion, so his capture makes perfect sense, especially with his potential to be the immensely powerful world shaman. And then, of course, there is his own personal history with Sylvanas. Again, like with Garrosh, it's possible that Thrall may have a few regrets. As for Bane, well, I think it's obvious. His constant criticism of Sylvanas probably means that his abduction is quite personal. And as for the storytellers at Blizzard, it could give them an opportunity to give him a reunion with his father. After these characters are captured, the remaining faction leaders gather at Icecrown. Bolvar tells them the full weight of what had happened, that the veil between life and death had been torn asunder, and that the Jailer was making his first open move against Azeroth. Tyrande, as I previously said, not really taking heed of Varian's lessons of patience as taught in Pandaria, jumps straight in ahead of us. And of course, after her, we go through that portal with Bolvar, and that is where the Shadowlands expansion begins. But it is not where today's video ends, for there is another thing that we noticed, something that I think you should be aware of. I cannot guarantee that this will come to pass, but take a listen. All the Alliance and Horde characters who end up in the Shadowlands are all people who are instrumental in the trial of Garrosh Hellscream. Tyrande provided the prosecution, Bane was a key witness, Anduin had almost been killed by Garrosh during the Divine Bell situation, Jaina purged Dalaran because of Garrosh's agents and was key in the War Crimes book. Well, we know from Afterlife's Revendreth that Garrosh is chained up in Castle Nathria, essentially being used as an anima battery. So, what do you think is going to happen when we find his cell? Will Jaina be overcome with rage? Will Thrall sort of break down at the situation? Will he finally end up confronting his mistakes? Will, say, Bane Bloodhoof, in fact, forgive Garrosh, perhaps paving the way for Garrosh to be redeemed? And that's hard to know. Garrosh is in Revendreth. It is a realm of redemption through the purging of sins, so if Garrosh was to be redeemed, where would he end up? I mean, imagine a Garrosh whose flaws did not co-opt his strengths. Is that really a person who's all that different from Varian Wrynn? Maybe he would end up in the same realm as Varian Wrynn, and perhaps that could be patch content. Just a speculation. So there you have it. Today's video was all about the core cast of characters who end up with us in the Shadowlands and tracking their recent stories so that no matter where you enter Shadowlands and come to this video, you're going to understand what's up with those familiar face characters. There's a lot more though. I would highly recommend you check out our other Shadowlands lore videos. We are working on a really big timeline video as well, one that will take you through everything you need to know from a big historical level, like real timeline cosmic stuff. Past that though, you should really check out the last few lore videos that we've done. They cover vital things, from a full rundown of the Lich King connection to the Jailer and all of this stuff, which, believe me, will be very big, to say how the Nathrezim aren't what we think, and a whole bunch more. I love doing the lore content. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching today's video. And with that said, I will see you next time.